This talk is hosted by the Institute for Contemporary Ethics, which is our new ethics institute that's about 1.5 years old, at the School of Philosophy at the Northwest University. And we welcome you to our second talk in our talk series this year that's entitled Thinking Our Environmental Future, Conversations on the Environment, Climate and Ethics. So as we all know, these are really important issues, and we really want to highlight the way philosophers have been dealing with these issues. So I'm so pleased and so excited today to welcome Professor Workineh Kelbessa from Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia today. Professor Kelbessa does research on environmental ethics, development ethics, climate ethics, water ethics, philosophy of love and sex, globalization, African philosophy, and comparative philosophy. On a more personal note, in my own work, I've found Professor Kelbessa's work to be hugely influential in just trying to understand how African philosophers have thought about environmental philosophy. So today, Professor Kelbessa will discuss a talk entitled Environmental Philosophy and African Traditions of Thought. So with no further ado, Professor Kelbessa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yolandi Coetser, for this generous introduction, and I'm very happy to be with you this morning. The title of my presentation is Environmental Philosophy in African Traditions of Thought. So I'm going to talk about, in the first place, I will introduce the subject, and then I'll briefly look at African environmental philosophy or ethics. There are two arguments. The first one is arguments against African environmental philosophy. The second part deals with arguments for African environmental philosophy and ethics. And then I'll briefly look at weaknesses of indigenous environmental knowledge in Africa. And next, challenge to indigenous environmental knowledge. And finally, I'll make general conclusion. So introduction. The purpose of this lecture is to present a very brief introduction to the environmental thought and worldviews of some traditions in Africa. So I will try to indicate whether African environmental ethics and philosophy are embedded in the multiplicity of African worldviews. So let me briefly indicate about environmental ethics and philosophy. From the very beginning, environmental philosophers in the West narrowly conceived environmental philosophy as environmental ethics. And there is a kind of historical and human side to the story. As you know, particularly in the 20th century, there was a rift between the what we call Anglo-American or analytic philosophy and continental philosophy. So when you look at analytic philosophy, analytic philosophers try to focus on science as the paradigm of knowledge. And this analytic philosophy focuses on conceptual clarity, logical rigor, empirical soundness, scientific validity of arguments. Particularly for analytic philosophers, philosophy didn't exist in the West until the advent of analytic philosophy in the 20th century. So for these philosophers, particularly the works of Plato, Aristotle, Kant, Hegel, and so forth are not really philosophy, but they refer to intellectual history. But another less extreme position is that the only philosophy that is existing in the world is Western philosophy since the time of ancient Greek philosophers. But in other cultures, in non-Western societies, there is no philosophy. So that is the position of analytic philosophers. And when we look at continental philosophy considers philosophy as the expression of culture. And therefore, this continental philosophy considers larger philosophical themes, such as the nature of being, existence, consciousness, and so on and so forth. So for continental philosophers, analytic philosophy is not really philosophy. Similarly, for analytic philosophers, continental philosophy cannot be considered as philosophy. So because of this, in particular in the US and in some European universities, there is a contradiction between the two groups, and even in the same faculty, they don't speak to each other, but gradually they changed this. And again, environmental philosophers have been influenced by this rift between the two traditions. In particular, Anglo-American philosophers began environmental ethics as a project in the 1970s. So environmental philosophy, or in particular environmental ethics, began in the 1970s in response to environmental crisis, particularly in the 1960s. So philosophers thought that they are going to save the world. And because of this, therefore, some Anglo-American philosophers try to establish environmental ethics on the basis of, for example, utilitarianism, deontology, natural rights, and so on. So they considered this as the framework for discussing the environment. But continental philosophers are latecomers, so they came later on and they try to rely on phenomenology and other continental philosophical traditions. In particular, they say that eco-phenomenology is the basis of environmental philosophy. So in spite of the conflict between the two groups, environmental ethics and philosophy have gradually become mainstream. And gradually, environmental ethicists and continental eco-philosophers try to speak to each other and try to organize joint annual conferences. And they adopted interdisciplinary approach, and they also introduced their own respective journals. So when you look at this, in particular, analytic philosophers try to develop what they call environmental ethics. As I've said, environmental ethics and environmental philosophy were considered to be one and the same at the outset, but particularly continental eco-philosophers try to talk about environmental philosophy. So when you look at the two traditions, the relationship between environmental ethics and environmental philosophy is the relationship between part and whole. So let me try to define these important concepts. What is the difference between environmental philosophy and environmental ethics? Environmental philosophy is a broad subject, and it includes, among others, environmental ethics. It also includes environmental aesthetics, eco-justice, and certain kinds of explorations of epistemology, metaphysics, ontology, language, architecture, environmental humanism, philosophy of science, technology, political theory, political action, global justice, and at the same time other environmental movements in this connection, among others, for example, what we call social ecology, ecofeminism, and so on and so forth. So environmental philosophy argues for a much wider, more comprehensive view of the relation of environmentalism to philosophy, culture, life, and thought. What about environmental ethics? Environmental ethics is a subject which studies the ethical relationship between human beings and the natural environment. So that is why I've said that environmental ethics can be considered as part of, on the one hand, applied ethics, which is both theoretical and at the same time practical, and it is also part of environmental philosophy in general. And again, when we talk about African environmental philosophy, as you know, we don't find African environmental philosophy in written form. So a number of African philosophers try to reconstruct African philosophy from various African traditions. And therefore, there is no single African worldview. So we can talk about African environmental philosophies. So in this lecture, I will use the concept African environmental philosophy to refer to the underlying common or shared environmental worldviews of the African people. So one can say that African environmental philosophy is rooted in diverse cultural and philosophical traditions across the continent. And again, we can talk about indigenous environmental ethic, and indigenous environmental ethics. What is the difference between the two? We can use the term an indigenous environmental ethics to refer to the set of values and beliefs of an individual or a group of people relating to the environment. So these are important concepts I'm going to employ in my lecture. So let us talk about African environmental philosophy and ethics. As I said, there are two arguments against and for African environmental philosophy. Let me briefly look at arguments against African environmental philosophy. So for some philosophers and even non-philosophers and religious, for example, scholars, African worldviews lack environmental values, environmental concerns, because they said African worldviews are exclusively anthropocentric. Among others, for example, John Baird Callicott, an American philosopher, also shared this belief, and Mbiti, Kenyan theologian, and again, Penny Enslin and Kai Horsmek and others also shared this view. So let me give you one example. For example, according to Enslin and Horsmek, some of the values and principles claimed to be emphasized by Ubuntu are dubious. For example, the assertion that it fosters respect for the environment is questionable. A concern for the environment could be fostered only on the basis of human benefits and would therefore not amount to an acknowledgement of the intrinsic value of nature or the environment, let alone respect. In fact, in focusing exclusively on human beings, Ubuntu is by definition speciesist, end of quote. So for them, I will come back to the concept Ubuntu. Ubuntu said that I am a person because of other persons. I will try to define this concept later. But for these two scholars, Ubuntu philosophy is by definition speciesist because it favors human beings at the expense of other beings. Because of this, in general, for some scholars, anthropocentrism characterizes traditional African worldviews. So environmental ethics is lacking in African traditions, in African worldviews. So that is one position. But there are arguments for African environmental philosophy. So there are some scholars, African and non-African scholars, who try to indicate that African philosophy is a living tradition in Africa. So let me briefly look at research in African environmental ethics and environmental philosophy. So when you look at the works of some African philosophers, particularly environmental thinking in African traditions, were not given sufficient attention by African philosophers and non-African philosophers. When Western philosophers tried to deal with this problem, African philosophers were silent on this issue. But the first African scholar who directly discussed about traditional African land ethics was a Tanzanian sociologist, Omari. But since the publication of his chapter in 1990, some other African philosophers have also tried to reconstruct African environmental ethics from diverse traditions of African ethnic groups. So I can mention some members of the first generation of African environmental philosopher, the late Henry Odera Oruka of Kenya, John Petrus Hatting, of my colleague from South Africa, Stellenbosch University, the late Kawasi Uredu from Ghana, Segun Ogimbemi, and myself. I started to do research on this subject since the 1996, and another colleague from Zimbabwe, Murov. And in particular, Professor Odera Oruka organized the World Congress of Philosophy on the themes of environment, development, and their philosophical bearing in Nairobi in 1991. And he invited various scholars from all over the world. And they discussed, therefore, different aspects of environmental ethics, including African environmental views and traditions. And in particular, Stellenbosch University established a unit of environmental ethics in 1992 as part of its Center for Applied Ethics. Johan Hatting was the leader of this unit, and he contributed a lot to the development of environmental ethics in Stellenbosch University. He was also a member of Environmental Ethics Association. And again, two other scholars, although they were not philosophers, they talked about wilderness and the Bantu mind. They published an article in the journal Environmental Ethics in 1994, and they tried to discuss the world views of some ethnic groups, particularly in Kenya. And again, the second generation of African environmental philosophers, and of course non-African philosophers include Tangwa, Chemuru and Masaka, Ojomo, Ikewelo, the late Ikewelo from Nigeria, Mangena, Berens, my colleague from South Africa, and Ikonebe, Francis, and Metz is an American scholar who is based in South Africa, and Ize and others. So these scholars coined different phrases to refer to African environmental philosophy. As I said, Omari called it traditional African land ethics, and Calicut considered it African biometric biocommunitarianism, and again, Ogunome called it ethics of nature relatedness. And I personally call this tradition indigenous environmental ethics, and others call it indigenous environmental philosophy, and Tangwa called it eco-biocommunitarianism. And again, Murov called it African environmental ethics, and other scholars also studied Shona people's environmental ethics. And my colleague Ikewelo from South Africa, from Nigeria, studied Igbo environmental ethics. And again, my colleague from South Africa preferred the word African relational environmentalism. And again, Metz, an American scholar, coined the term African model relationalism. And again, another colleague, Ize, called it humanitatis eco, and so on and so forth. And again, there are also other scholars who published articles and at the same time edited books. Among others, my colleagues, Rainer Ebert, a colleague from Germany, and Antena Roba, an Ethiopian scholar, edited a book entitled Africa and Her Animals, Philosophical and Practical Perspective. This book includes various articles on animals in the continent. And again, another colleague, Kemiru, also edited a book entitled African Environmental Ethics. And other African scholars also wrote BA thesis, master's thesis, and PhD dissertation. Just to give you some examples, Murov wrote a master's thesis in 1999. I also wrote my PhD thesis on Oromo environmental ethics in 2001. And Ikewelo from Nigeria also wrote his PhD thesis in 2008. Brain also wrote his PhD thesis dissertation in 2011 of African philosophy and African relational environmentalism. And Kemiru also did the same in 2016. So some African philosophers have particularly studied the world views of different ethnic groups. Just to give you some examples, Obenga, although he was not very much concerned with the philosophical and the environmental values of ancient Egyptians, but he wrote about the history of philosophical tradition in ancient Egypt. So he talked about ancient Egyptians, and another colleague, Forliker, also did the same. I studied the Oromo of Ethiopia, the environmental ethics of the Oromo of Ethiopia. And in particular, Calicut also briefly discussed in his book, Earth's Insights, published in 1994, The Son of South Central Africa. And again, Tangwa from Cameroon studied the environmental ethics of the Niso of the grassy highlands of Bamenda, and Murov and others studied the environmental ethics of the Shona of Zimbabwe, and Ikewolo, the Igbo of Nigeria. And my colleague again, Fayemi, studied the environmental ethics of the Yoruba of Nigeria and Benin. And again, another colleague, Tosam, studied the environmental views of the Com of Cameroon. So these scholars concluded that so different groups in Africa have developed a holistic view of the world. So in general, we can say that African worldview promotes the interdependence and harmony of all creatures. So I'm going to give you some examples. Let me briefly talk about the views of ancient Egyptians. For ancient Egyptians, the foundation of all reality is none. None is a primeval chaotic water, which is the foundation of all things. All things rely on this primeval chaotic water. And the sun god, Ran Atom, comes from this none and as a power of self-development and started the process of creation. So therefore, the sun god created other things from none. So we have a kind of thermomorphic gods, which has also a kind of animal body. And we have also an ethical principle, which is called Mad, which is the ethical principle of ancient Egyptians. So ancient Egyptians were the first to renounce anthropocentrism and vengeance. So therefore, ancient Egyptians developed a holistic worldview. There is no absolute boundary between the material world and the spiritual world. Unlike Western philosophical tradition, therefore, the material world is the basis of all things. Even Atum Ra, or Ra Atum, the sun god, comes from none. So when you look at this, it explains the difference between Egyptian philosophy and Western philosophy. But in Western philosophy, for some Western philosophers, God is the creator of all things. So ancient Egyptian math philosophy stresses harmony, justice, and balance in human nature interactions. So there are different examples of environmental holism in Africa. So for many African societies, object and subject are interrelated. The sacred and the profane, the physical and the spiritual are interrelated. There is no absolute boundary between the two. So for for African philosophers, reality is a holistic community of human beings, non-human beings, and the natural world. And let me talk about the Oromo of Ethiopia. The Oromo is the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia. According to some scholars, the Oromo are the first truly democratic polity. For the Oromo, Waka created the world. So Waka is the creator of the world, and they consider Earth the mother of all things. And Waka, Earth, and human beings are interrelated. Ayana is the ideal, and Uma has two different meanings. God is also considered as Uma. It means on the one hand creator, and it also means the physical world. So the three important concepts are interrelated. Ayana is a refraction of Waka, and Uma is the physical thing. And Safu is an important ethical concept which governs the relationship between different entities. Among others, for example, there is Safu between teachers and students. There is Safu between a husband and a wife. There is Safu between different categories. So in addition to this, again, Safu implies both rights and duties. So these important concepts, Waka, Ayana, and Safu, provide the metaphysical underpinning of an environmental ethics, the underlying environmental attitudes towards nature and society. According to the Oromo people, God allows them to use different things in this world, but God doesn't allow them to overexploit natural resources and even fellow human beings. Humans are given a special role with responsibility. So human beings are an equal part of a vibrant, interconnected whole. And as I said earlier, Safu governs the relationship between different entities, different species, and at the same time the use of resources. In this connection, we can talk about spiritual significance of nature. Oromo cultural practices involve rituals, ceremonies, and songs that honor natural elements like mountains, rivers, and trees. So among others, for example, the Oromo people have their own songs, their own proverbs, riddles. They use these oral traditions to appreciate nature and at the same time respect nature. These practices reflect the spiritual significance of nature and the belief in its inherent value. There is another important concept in Oromo worldview, which is the Gada system. Let me briefly talk about the Gada system and environmental stewardship. So the Gada system is a central institution in Oromo society. It is a democratic egalitarian system with its own leader who runs the government of the Oromo society for a non-renewable term of 8 years. Gada leaders are elected on the basis of merit. Therefore, they have to pass through different training before assuming power. So in order to lead their own people, they have to be knowledgeable. So we can say that Plato's philosopher kings and at the same time the Gada leaders have a similar role. In other words, they have to be knowledgeable to lead their society. But if they fail to fulfill the role, the Oromo people can remove them from power. So that's very, very important. And the Gada government most of the time formulates different laws, environmental laws, social laws, political laws, and so forth. In Oromo society, laws are not fixed. Laws are subject to change. So they revise laws during the General Assembly. So they change some laws that are not compatible with the existing situation. And they can also introduce new laws. And that is very, very important. So I'll come back to this in particular relation to animals and trees and so forth. So the Gada system organizes the Oromo society into groups that assume different responsibilities in the society every 8 years. So unlike in the Western democratic traditions, power is distributed across generations and age groups in the Oromo Gada government. So the most important element of the Gada system is the system promotes intergenerational equity. In other words, therefore, different generations are required to fulfill the responsibilities. The current generation is required to leave a livable environment for the coming generation. Therefore, we see a kind of intergenerational equity. It is also important to note that the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, added the Gada system to this intangible heritage list in 2016. So the Gada system is a living tradition in the Oromo society. And again, regarding eco-cultural practices, Oromo communities have traditional practices that promote environmental conservation. Among others, this includes managing pastures, rotating agricultural fields, and using herbs to use these herbs to heal different diseases, for example, derived from indigenous botanical knowledge. And again, another important part of Oromo environmental ethics is the Oromo people formulated animal laws and animal ethics long before the 1970s, when Western philosophers have attempted to talk about environmental ethics animal ethics in the 1970s. But the Oromo people formulated environmental laws before 1970s, I think many centuries ago. So the purpose of this is to avoid the mistreatment of animals. Just to give you one example, the Oromo formulated what they call Sera Farda. Farda means horse, what you call horse laws, or Seragola, laws of the paddock, in order to control the mistreatment of animals by humans. Just to give you one example, for example, if the owner of a horse failed to feed and water his own horse, and as a result his horse dies, the community will punish this person. In the distant part, a person who failed to take care of his horse, and when his horse dies, he was required to pay about 30 head of cattle. Currently, a person who failed to do so will be forced to pay about 100 head of cattle. Similarly, if a person kills a fellow human being, he will be required to pay about 100 head of cattle in traditional laws. So when you look at these, horses and at the same time human beings have similar laws and respect among the Oromo community. Why? Because horses have different roles. Similarly, if a person, the owner also failed to feed his donkey and at the same time his donkey aborts or dies, the community will also punish this person, and that is very, very important. So in the Oromo society, humans, animals, and nature are interconnected. This interconnectedness is not just physical, but also spiritual, with an emphasis on maintaining a harmonious relationship between all elements of the ecosystem. And let me briefly talk about Ubuntu philosophy and the natural environment. And as I've already stated, for some scholars, African ethics is anthropocentric and Ubuntu ethics is also anthropocentric. But let me try to indicate whether this is really the case. So the question is, what is Ubuntu? Ubuntu is used in different languages in different parts of the continent, even in Eastern Africa, in Southern Africa, in Central Africa, and so forth. So generally, Ubuntu in different languages means humanness. So a person is only a person through other persons. The identity of a person is determined by his or her membership of a group. As you know, different scholars wrote about Ubuntu, and in different fields, they try to emphasize the nature of Ubuntu. As far as I know, a South African philosopher, Mogobe Ramose, provided a philosophical exposition of Ubuntu philosophy. In his book, published in 1999, African Philosophy Through Ubuntu, he has one chapter in that book, Ecology Through Ubuntu. So he defined the term Ubuntu in different ways. So for him, Ubuntu is a compound word containing Ubu and Nitu. What do we mean by Ubu? Ubu is the highest level of generality in ontological terms, in terms of being. And again, Nitu, the suffix of this concept, which means it is in a state of motion. It is not static. It is in perpetual suspension. But these Ubu and Nitu are not fixed entities, but they are called mutually founding in the sense that they are two aspects of being as a oneness and an indivisible wholeness, end of quote, according to Ramose. So in Ubuntu philosophy, we can talk about the relationship between an individual and a community. Which comes first? I would like to ask you to try to indicate which comes first, an individual or a community. So in Ubuntu philosophy, there is no contradiction between an individual and a community. And when you look at this, out of relationality in action with and through others, through other persons, a community is born. So individuals come first, and through the relationship and at the same time action, a community will come into being. So here, being means fundamentally relationality. So I am what I am because of what I am related, therefore we are. So in African worldview, quote, so whether at birth, conception and days, Africans are always in community, end of quote, according to Dolamo. So in African worldview, particularly in Ubuntu ethics, the sense of belonging is very, very important. In African society is to be means to belong. I belong to my own family. I belong to my own community. I belong to my ethnic group. I belong to my country. I belong to my continent. I belong to the world as a whole. So that is very, very important. And again, we also find the ethic of sharing in Oromo and Ubuntu societies, particularly in Southern African countries. So when a person is in need, we are required to support him, particularly in Oromo society. If a person is in a very difficult situation, each individual, each citizen is required to give his own fair share to support this individual who is in a very difficult situation. If he fails to do so, the community sometimes will force him to pay his own fair share. So you will also find this in Ubuntu societies. So that is an important point which tells you the difference between Western tradition and Ubuntu ethics. And again, let me come back to the question I've already raised. For some philosophers, because of the very meaning of Ubuntu, I am what I am because of what we all are. I'm a person through other persons. At the surface, some people thought that Ubuntu is anthropocentric, but that is not really the case. When we look at Ubuntu philosophy very carefully, human beings have a natural duty to care for themselves and at the same time for the physical nature as a whole. So there are some philosophers who try to reject the view that Ubuntu philosophy is speciesist by nature. Speciesism is favoring one's own species. Among others, for example, an American philosopher, Metz, coined, as I said, African model relationalism. And he said that African relationalism is not speciesist because, quote, the reason for favoring human beings in cases whether their urgent interests are at stake is not the mere fact that they are human, end of quote. So for him, unlike mainstream anthropocentrism, African model relationalism conceives moral status in terms of the act that typical human beings have certain ability to commune as subjects. In that sense, you might say that there are some aspects of anthropocentrism, but human beings and other beings, such as, for example, elephants, chimps, dolphins, and so forth, also share these values, commune as subjects, although we don't say that these are one and the same. So there are different degrees of these positions. So Ubuntu emphasizes interconnectedness and the importance of community. So it extends to environmental ethics, encouraging stewardship and sustainable use of resources. Human beings cannot survive without the well-being of the natural world. So this worldview encourages sustainable living, as harming the environment would disrupt the harmony essential for community well-being. Another important concept in African tradition is Okama, which is an important concept in Shona. Particularly Murov and other Zimbabwean philosophers studied this concept. It means relatedness. So in Ukama, relatedness permits all aspects of existence. So there is an ukama between different generations, between the present generation, living generation, and at the same time, the living dead. So the principles of Ubuntu, in particular, according to Murov, and particularly Ukama and Ubuntu, laid the foundation of African environmental ethics. But the point is, the principles of Ubuntu and Ukama are not always practically applicable, but because of practical problems, the problems of poverty, development, and so forth, sometimes people may violate the basic principles of Ubuntu. Sometimes some people attack, for example, Black Africans in South Africa, because some people thought that they come to South Africa and take their own jobs. And when you look at this, partly this is because of the problem that is rampant in the continent. By doing it, therefore, sometimes people are forced to violate their own environmentally friendly ethical principles. And again, African environmental ethics recognizes the proper place of non-human animals in the cosmic world and relatedness among human and non-human beings and the environment. As I said, for example, the Oromo of Ethiopia. There are also environmental taboos and restrictions. So on the basis of some taboos, some people refrain, for example, cutting down what they call sacred trees, and at the same time going to some places. So in one way or another, therefore, these environmental taboos and restrictions have contributed to the protection of the natural environment. So according to Ali Mazuri and others, quote, traditional African culture had started from the premise that the whole universe, not merely man, had been created in the image of God. This is very, very important, because in Christian tradition, man is created in the image of God. But in traditional African ethics, the whole universe had been created in the image of God. And so many African societies made some trees sacred, some hills holy, some animals totemic siblings, some forests the abode of ancestors. African cultures made no sharp distinction between the human race and other species. While some monkeys were sacred, some humans were evil. So for Africans, nature has intrinsic value precisely because it is sacred and divine. So according to Africans, at the same time, we can talk about the relationship between trees and at the same time the local weather and climate patterns. And because of this, therefore, some ethnic groups in Africa developed some climate adaptation and mitigation strategies to deal with weather change. For instance, just to give you some examples, African peasant farmers and pastoralists have developed indigenous coping strategies and tactics, including livelihood diversification of herds and crops, replanting forests, cultivation of heat and drought resistant crops, early maturing crops and high yield varieties, adoption of hard varieties of crops, multiple cropping and intercropping, crop selection and plot dispersal, replanting when crops are lost, relocating farms, selecting keeping of livestock in areas where rainfall declined, settlement and resettlement activities. They also migrate to different places. They change planting dates and they also use irrigation. They use local plants to control pests. And as I said, they also move away from dependency on arable farming into petty trade of assorted items, including salt, pepper, and so forth. And at the same time, they use wild fruits and vegetables during climate crisis and drought. And most of the time, therefore, they spread risks and in relation to change in climate across locations, time, and the diversity of materials. For example, when a crop drops in one particular area, they move to another place and they try to plant this crop. if it doesn't work there again, they will move to another place. Therefore, they spread risk and try to save their life and the lives of their livestock. So in this connection, pastoralists also use the following adaptation strategies. Among others, they use emergency fodder in times of drought, multi-species composition of herds that can withstand climate extremes. They cull, for example, weak livestock for consumption during climate crisis. And they also replace cattle with sheep and goats. In South Africa, I can also remind you or give you just one example, the Mafisa system in the Limpopo Basin of South Africa. When they face climate crisis, usually what they do is they loan cattle to poor households. And these poor households and relatives at different locations keep these cattle and at the same time use their labor and milk and so forth. And later on, they return back these animals to the real owners of these. And finally, they will also get payment for this. And that is very, very important. But because of the current developmental challenge, the people could not, therefore, keep this system in place. People also use indigenous forecasting and early warning systems. For example, they read the behavior of animals and at the same time the basic features of different trees. And they will forecast what will happen in the future, and they try to prepare themselves to deal with, therefore, these problems. In brief, Africans believe in the interdependence of human beings, animals, plants, and the natural world. African worldviews regard human beings and the non-human world as extensions of each other. They don't regard the earth as a commodity, but as the source of survival. In African worldviews, well-being is relational, and the well-being of humanity cannot be achieved without the well-being of the earth. They are related. They are part of the same whole. In African worldviews, human beings are in nature and part of nature in balance with the whole. When human beings see themselves as outside of nature, it is purely for the purpose of conceptual need. The purpose here is to engage in conceptual analysis. Even here, humans are still in nature. This is very, very important. So African worldviews promote intergenerational justice. So as I said, each generation has its own role and at the same time is required to, for example, the current generation is required to live a livable environment for the generation to come. If it fails to do so, therefore, it violates intergenerational ethics in Africa. So for many African cultural groups, the community comprises of three domains: the domain of the living, the domain of the living dead, or what we call ancestors, and the domain of the yet to be born. So the living tradition, the current generation is required to get married. Otherwise, this generation cannot continue. So that is one of the responsibilities of the present generation. So the three generations are interrelated and therefore they are interdependent. But on the other hand, in Western tradition, in what we call Eurocentric global north worldview, societies are conceived as aggregates of self-interested individuals in constant competition with each other over resources. In particular, this is a classical liberal and neo-liberal worldview. And let me briefly talk about weaknesses of indigenous environmental knowledge in Africa. The first weakness or limitation of indigenous environmental ethics, or particularly indigenous environmental knowledge, is regional specificity, the localization of indigenous knowledge system. Most of the time, indigenous environmental knowledge is restricted to a particular area. And because of this restriction, it is very difficult for local indigenous knowledge, for example, to deal with complex environmental problems. For example, transnational pollution, climate change, and the depletion of ozone layer. So it's very difficult to use indigenous knowledge to address these global environmental problems. Secondly, there are also some environmentally destructive practices. So in spite of the fact that indigenous environmental knowledge is the source of ecological wisdom, sometimes some practices are also the source of environmental foolishness. Therefore, we should not overemphasize the value of indigenous environmental knowledge. And the third limitation is excessive and undue attention to the ancestors. So most of the time, this has become a barrier to the cultivation of an innovative outlook. So sometimes these serve as resistant to change, to development and so forth. So in that sense, sometimes therefore, we can also consider it as one of the limitations of indigenous knowledge. And another limitation is reluctance to transmit some expertise and the stagnation of science. For example, if you look at traditional herbalists, usually traditional herbalists are not willing to share their knowledge of different trees, different species. Even they are not willing to share this knowledge with all of their children. But sometimes they choose one of their children and share their knowledge so that they will rely on this knowledge. So that discourages, therefore, the expansion of knowledge. So we can also consider that this as a weakness of indigenous knowledge. And in the past, and sometimes even these days, hunting for trophies is also can also be considered as one weakness. So personally, as a student of environmental philosophy, I'm against this tradition. So this has been the case in many African traditions. And another weakness is sexism, gender discrimination, and oppression. Sometimes women are not given their due share in politics and at the same time in other institutions. So men use, for example, proverbs and other traditions to exploit a woman in many ethnic groups in the continent. So that can be also considered as one weakness. So I can also give you in this connection, for example, in a remote society, a woman cannot be the leader of the Gada system. But they give me some reasons because they said they don't stay with us, they join the relatives of their husbands. So because of this, we don't allow them to do so. And because of that, they are not the leaders of the Gada system. But really, even if they move to other places, they can be allowed to be the leaders of the society. But the Oromo men don't allow them to the leaders of the Gada system. Polygamy is another weakness of indigenous tradition, because you have to feed different members of your society and different wives, and that will have negative impacts on the natural environment. So when we look at this, we can't suggest that we have to go back to our tradition, the golden age. So that is called the means of return. There is just no pre-colonial place to go back, according to Leonard Prague. Caesar also cautions against hopes of going back to a pre-colonial culture. And a Ghanaian philosopher, Kwame Jeche, also talked about unbridled traditionalism, because he said, quote, unbridled traditionalism would be naive Sankofism, that is returning to the cultural past. Sankofa is an Akan word which means go back for it, return to it. In spite of the fact that we can derive some important lessons from ancient tradition, we can't suggest that we have to completely go back to our past. But what is important is a critical re-examination of old values. By doing this, therefore, we can adapt environmentally friendly practices and values, and we can also suspend environmentally destructive values. So indigenous knowledge needs to be complemented by modern knowledge in order to be more efficient. Indigenous knowledge alone cannot address all kinds of problems. Therefore, we need the integration of indigenous knowledge and at the same time modern knowledge. And let me deal with briefly the challenge to indigenous environmental knowledge. The first one is governments' linguistic acculturation and assimilation policies have had negative impacts on indigenous knowledge in many ethnic groups because some indigenous language were replaced with the language of the dominant group. And because of this, therefore, that has led to the disappearance of this language, and with this language, indigenous knowledge. And the introduction of new religions, for example, the introduction of Christianity and Islam, has had negative impacts on indigenous knowledge in different parts of the continent. Modernization and cultural alienation. So particularly for some Western scholars, modernization means kind of westernization. Therefore, modernization leads to, therefore, the eradication of indigenous values, indigenous cultural tradition. And the fourth challenge to indigenous environmental knowledge is global capitalism. In particular, the market economy has had negative impacts on indigenous people. Indigenous people were evicted from the land in the name of development, in the name of investment, and so forth. And again, the commercialization and privatization of knowledge has also had negative impacts on the development of indigenous knowledge. When knowledge is privatized, even some corporations and some scientists, after studying the world views of some peasant farmers, they try to patent their knowledge. And therefore, they will try to ask peasant farmers to pay royalties for their own indigenous knowledge that they have developed for centuries. And that has had negative impact on the development of knowledge. And transnational corporations have also negatively affected indigenous knowledge in different parts of the continent. And again, climate change has also led to negative impacts on seasonal cycles. Because of climate change and shifting ecologies, peasant farmers and pastoralists are in a very difficult situation to forecast about what will happen in the future. So their knowledge is no longer authentic. And because of this, therefore, climate change has also had negative impacts. And again, overexploitation of natural resources because of necessity, because of the fact that they don't have other options. Although they know that overexploiting natural resources will have negative impacts on their future, on their biodiversity and so on, peasant farmers are forced to overexploit their natural resources, precisely because they don't have other choices. And that has led to loss of biodiversity and at the same time ecosystems because of pollution, because of deforestation and so forth. They lost different species. And as I said again, linguistic and cultural barriers. As language fade and cultures change, there can be barriers to effective communication and understanding. And again, lack of resources for documentation. Many communities lack the infrastructure to record and preserve indigenous knowledge. As you know, there is one important proverb in Africa: when an old man dies, the library burns down. If we don't record the knowledge of these elders will die with their knowledge. So that is one of the challenges to indigenous knowledge. And another challenge is intergenerational knowledge gap. Because of modernization, because of modern schooling, education, particularly in most societies in Africa, the current generation is not interested in indigenous knowledge. Even myself, when I was a young man, I thought that indigenous knowledge was primitive, unscientific, and useless. But after I started to study the values of indigenous knowledge, I changed my mind. So because of this, therefore, some young people are not interested in indigenous knowledge. That has led to, therefore, the days of particularly elders with the knowledge, and that will lead to intergenerational knowledge gap. And the last point I would like to mention is inadequate legal protection. In some societies, indigenous people and their knowledge are not legally protected. Particularly, they don't have sufficient laws to protect their knowledge. So that will have negative impacts on the development of indigenous knowledge. And another challenge to studying African environmental ethics and African environmental philosophy is, on the one hand, a lack of solid theoretical and empirical research on African worldviews. And as I said, particularly African philosophers and non-philosophers started to talk about African indigenous traditions, environmental heritage, environmental values. But some scholars usually do not go to the field, and they try to study indigenous knowledge using, for example, interviews, interviewing knowledgeable people, including men and women, but they simply try to duplicate what has been restated, what has been discussed by other scholars. When, for example, you read the works of some writers, some of them, they repeated one and the same quote from one individual several times without reading the works of various scholars. And that is one point that leads to lack of memory. So they don't wholly read and at the same time study the works of various scholars and try to add their own fair share and try to develop and at the same time produce authentic African environmental ethics. So they simply repeat the same ideas and different words. So that has had negative impacts on the development of African environmental ethics. For example, if you Google, you'll find various works on African environmental ethics, environmental philosophy, and so forth. But when you read most of them, you don't find useful argument in these works. And let me conclude my presentation. First, unlike mainstream Western ethics, African environmental philosophy has renounced anthropomorphism, anthropocentrism, and ethnocentrism, and recognized the interconnectedness and interdependence of all beings and the more than human world. And second, African environmental ethics and philosophy emphasize that life is relational. Different cultural concepts, including Ubuntu, Ukama, Safu, and others, have been used to promote African relational ethics and our ethical obligations towards future human and non-human generations. Intra and intergenerational justice, the interconnectedness and interdependence of all life forms and the natural environment, respect for Mother Earth, and the like are important lessons for the contemporary world. Third, African environmental and climate policies have not been guided by the major ethical principles embodied in different African traditions. For example, interdependence, interconnectedness, mutual dependence, intra and intergenerational justice, environmental justice, communitarian ethics, relationality, generosity, do no harm, reciprocity, promote life and avoid killing, a live and let live attitude, human dignity, humanness, deep concern for future generations, and so forth. Fourth, African environmental philosophy had the potential to contribute to environmental rehabilitation, biodiversity conservation and sustainable development, climate change, mitigation and adaptation, thereby helping to address environmental and development problems in Africa. And the last one, this paper suggested that African philosophers and other professionals should continue to explore useful elements for a strong African environmental philosophy in African traditions of thought that can contribute to the solution of the current environmental crisis, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. I think please join me in giving a round of applause to Professor Kelbessa. I must say I took quite a lot from this talk, and I hope everyone else did too. I think Professor highlighted the kind of tension between theory and practice, which is, I think, something that us as environmental philosophers always struggle with, is how do we kind of deal with the practical while at the same time remaining true to our philosophies and you know, dealing with things more abstractly. For me, I think, having just read, I was reading the IPCC report a few days ago, and what was interesting about the latest IPCC report was how it emphasized indigenous knowledge systems as a way to mitigate climate change. So I think your talk really illustrated why this is necessary, that we deal with it, but at the same time also certain shortcomings of this approach. So thank you so much. I absolutely loved your talk. I learned a lot. So thank you so much. And just before I open the floor for questions, let me also maybe just abuse my place as chair to just plug my conference coming up, which Dr. Tablanche has posted in the comments. We are trying to establish a Southern African Society for Environmental Philosophy, and we've got some money from the National Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences. So hopefully in March next year, we'll be holding a conference in the Kruger National Park to kind of do exactly what Professor Kelbessa has said, and kind of bring new ideas and bring, you know, try to do this, you know, make African philosophy and African environmental philosophy you know, richer, and just bring new ideas to the table. So please have a look at that link as well in the chat. Okay, so I'm done abusing my place as chair. So I'm opening up the floor. Is there any questions, any comments from the floor that we can pose? I see we've got one unmuted mic. Abiodun, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, hello.
Hello, go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. Thanks, Professor Kelbessa, for your talk. I picked a number of things, and although I joined a bit late, and I've been keenly interested in this issue of environmental ethics, and thanks to some of your works that I have read. I mean, they've really helped me to see the kinds of things that Africans really need to do to at least contribute to environmental philosophy or environmental ethics broadly. But my question is this, and I think from all the literatures in African environmental ethics, African environmental philosophy, there is this common trend that we see in those literature. It's more or less like the argument centers around trying to perhaps think about non-anthropocentric theories for our environmental ethics. In fact, almost all environmental ethical theories or environmental ethicists in Africa would always suggest non-anthropocentric theories. And my question is this: why is it the case that we cannot just think about justifying humans' place, I mean, when it comes to the environment? The truth is, no matter how we think about environmental ethics, the place of human beings would always stand tall. And my thinking is that as much as we want to talk about the intrinsic value of nature, as long as we want to think about other species that needs to be also held in high esteem, we cannot possibly deny the fact that humans will still be at the center. So is it not possible to talk about weak anthropocentrism and differentiate that from a strong anthropocentrism, rather than just thinking about non-anthropocentric theories? That's my question.
Thank you very much for this excellent question, and this is a very good question. And you said that most of the time African philosophers emphasize non-anthropocentric elements of African worldviews. Now, that doesn't mean that Africans do not pay attention to the place of human beings. And as I said, we can say that African environmental philosophy incorporates both elements. On the one hand, anthropocentric concerns. Among others, African peasant farmers protect their environment precisely because their environment is useful to them, because they rely on their environment. For example, they rely on their land to meet their basic needs. And that is why, for example, they plant trees. For example, in Oromo society, there is one important proverb. It is better to plant a tree than to have a useless son. Here you will find anthropocentric elements, because if you plant trees, these trees serve as insurance. You can use these trees for different purposes. After you grow these trees, you can sell them. And at the same time, you can use trees as shade for you, and at the same time for your animals. But if your son is not really useful, your son will be a kind of burden on you. And again, that is why I have said that on the one hand, African environmental philosophy involves some anthropocentric concerns. They can also use different trees to deal with different diseases because they are useful. And biodiversity is very, very useful for African peasant farmers. And that is why they plant different crops and at the same time different trees. But that is why I've said that the relationship between human beings and the natural environment is not only physical, but at the same time it is also spiritual. As I said earlier, in Oromo society, for example, yes, different trees, different animals have anthropocentric value. They are useful, but you should not overexploit these crops and at the same time trees and so forth. Even in Oromo worldview, it would be wrong to overexploit fellow human beings. For example, in the distant past, when there was a devastating war between different groups, after they conquer their enemies, they don't consider the conquered people as their slaves. The Oromo people give them new names, and therefore they allow them to join the Oromo society. Therefore, at the end of the day, these conquered people are brothers and sisters of the Oromo people. So if you overexplode and at the same time mistreat fellow human beings, that will turn out to be morally wrong. That is unethical. So that is very important. And again, you said, instead of just talking about non-anthropocentric values, what about just talking about weak anthropocentrism and strong anthropocentrism? That is what an American philosopher, Norton, suggested. He criticized environmental philosophers for introducing abstract concepts which are really abstract and do not contribute to environmental consciousness. For him, for example, there is no need to talk about intrinsic value. So he was saying that not only Norton, even other environmental pragmatists also supported his view. Philosophers have been wasting their time talking about intrinsic value, non-intrinsic value, and so on and so forth. So he said that these are not really important. So he said, weak anthropocentrism is important, and it can be the basis of a good environmental policy. So for him, what is bad is what he calls a kind of strong anthropocentrism, which considers nature as this raw material that can be exploited at any cost. So he said we have to avoid this. You might say that, yeah, probably this is a good idea, but personally I have problems with this view, because sometimes what is good for human beings is not good for non-human beings. Look at, for example, land grabbing. In particular, after the 2008 and 2007 financial crisis, and particularly food crisis, some countries, Western countries, even from the East, even from the Middle East, come to Africa and lease lands for sometimes for 45 years and sometimes for 99 years. When they do this, among others, for example, they clear forests for agricultural land. When they do so, animals will lose their habitats. Therefore, animals cannot survive without this. So that is why I've said that this, probably you might say that this is good, particularly for external investors and for local people and so forth. But that will turn out to be very, very bad for animals, for local animals that have been living there. So because of this, you might say that therefore sometimes it is also important to talk about non-anthropocentric elements of our knowledge, our empirical and indigenous knowledge. So that is why we have said that we cannot simply talk about weak and strong anthropocentrism and avoid non-anthropocentric values, the inherent values of different entities. I have said that in Africa, reality has intrinsic value because it is sacred. We have also spiritual association with the natural environment. And that is why I've said that it is sometimes important to also emphasize the non-anthropocentric elements of environmental African environmental philosophy and at the same time environmental knowledge.
Thank you so much. I think we've got three comments now. So what I'll do is I'll take it in a round of three, and then perhaps you can respond to those three in one answer, if that's okay. So Mateus asks in the chat, could you expand on the specific methodologies you use in your work to disclose the environmental philosophies embodied in the social and cultural practices of Indigenous communities? And that's a great question. It's a question that I also always wonder about, is like extrapolating kind of the philosophy from the cultural practices. And then we've got Heno and Rulof that also want to ask a question. So I'll give the two of you a chance to ask your question, and then Professor Kelbessa can just respond to all three of those questions.
So the first one is, I think he was talking about the methodologies we use to try to drive indigenous knowledge, indigenous environmental knowledge from different traditions. When we talk about indigenous knowledge is not static. Indigenous knowledge is dynamic. It involves old ideas, new ideas, and it involves internally generated knowledge, externally borrowed knowledge, and at the same time adapted knowledge. And therefore, we can say that indigenous knowledge is dynamic, indigenous knowledge is continuous, and it is subject to change. And therefore, for example, when I did my PhD, on the one hand, what I did was I reviewed different works on indigenous traditions, particularly on Oromo worldviews. And then I tried to study, for example, proverbs, riddles, songs, and so forth, gathered by other scholars, among others from the West, and at the same time indigenous scholars in Ethiopia. And after that, what I did was I went to rural Ethiopia, and therefore I approached the local people, the leaders of different groups, including government leaders. And I approached these people and tried to identify knowledgeable persons who are familiar with indigenous values, indigenous traditions, who have the knowledge of trees, the knowledge of animals, the knowledge of crops. And then I grouped these informants. So I usually approach, therefore, people who can tell me, people who are really knowledgeable about these values. And then I try to interview them. And I also try to group these into two different groups. Some of them have the communal knowledge of their own people, but they are not really critical. So they can tell you different proverbs. They can tell you different songs. But when you try to raise critical philosophical questions, some of them are not happy. So among others, for example, I asked them about the role of women, why women are excluded from political power. So if one of my informants was angry, he said, "How can you ask us this question? You are not supposed to ask similar questions." So I call this, as the late Odera Oruka identified, some sage, folk sage. So what I did was I simply asked them to express their own views. But some of them, as I said, are not critical. They don't really use reason, and they don't try to answer your critical questions. But there are other groups who can be considered as philosophers, indigenous philosophers, because who can use reason and who can respond to your critical questions, who can tell you different and particularly deep proverbs that will tell you the world views of their own people. So I consider these are philosophic sage. That is what Odera Oruka also did. I also used the method adapted by Odera Oruka when he studied philosophic sagacity in Kenya in 1980s and early 1990s. He passed away in 1995. So you can derive, therefore, indigenous environmental knowledge from proverbs and at the same time from riddles, from songs, and you should also observe. Observation is another important method to try to study indigenous values, indigenous traditions. You should be part and parcel of the society, and you have to persuade the people to tell you their authentic knowledge. Otherwise, they don't, if they don't trust you, they don't tell you the basic elements of the knowledge. Because most of the time, when external researchers go to rural Ethiopia, and not only in Ethiopia, even in other parts of the continent, they thought that these researchers come to our place to destroy our knowledge and at the same time to rob our knowledge. So that is why I've said that most of the time they don't usually give information, authentic information. Yeah, they can tell you probably something that is not really reliable and that is not acceptable. That is very important to develop trust first and foremost before intervening and at the same time before approaching the local people. So that is very important. If you try to develop trust and if you try to tell them that you are trying to study the knowledge and so that they will also benefit from this knowledge, they will tell you what they know, and even they want to understand and your own knowledge, and they even try to improve their own knowledge. So that is why I've said that these are very important sources of knowledge. And like scientists, you can also find indigenous scientists. Like scientists, peasant farmers, pastoralists also use experiments. They also use observation. And as I said earlier on, for example, they plant one particular crop at one particular area, and they see the reaction of this crop to different soil. So they identify fertile soil and the soil that is not conducive to different crops, and they also understand the nature of different trees and the behavior of animals and so on. So on the basis of their own observation, their own experiment and so forth, they develop their own knowledge. So indigenous knowledge itself is based on experiment, based on, at the same time, observation and so on and so forth. But you can't say that indigenous scientists and modern scientists are equal, because peasant farmers and pastoralists don't use scientific machines. They don't have, for example, telescope, microscope, and so on and so forth. So that is why I've said that it's very important to integrate both indigenous knowledge and at the same time modern scientific knowledge. So the joint efforts of the peasant farmers and scientists can help us to address many problems which cannot be addressed in isolation. So that is very important. So that is what I would like to say regarding the second question. So you also raised the third question. What is the third question?
Still questions coming from the floor. Sorry, that was just one question that you dealt with now. So we still have two more questions from the floor. So that was only the one question. I'm sorry to interrupt you. So we actually have two geographers, I think, in the room as well. So perhaps we can give the two of them the chance to ask the second and the third question, and then you can respond there. And then we've got one more question from Mompati as well. So let's give Heno and Rulof chance to ask two questions, and then perhaps you can respond to them. And then Mompati, I think you will have the final question then to conclude the session. So Heno, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yes, good morning. Thanks, Prof. Kelbessa. This was a really interesting talk. I guess I have a comment/question which we can expand on a little bit. But for me, a term that you used in the beginning of your talk, which I thought was interesting, was the term holism. And excuse my lack of philosophical terminology and understanding in this regards, but this term, in my mind, was defined very much by a Western, what would you call it, academic, and the use of this term tells us that, you know, Western thought isn't necessarily different from African thought. This idea that we are connected to our environment, we do care about our environment, isn't purely an African African philosophical idea. And then secondly, and this is from taking theory into practice perspective, is that what you say about the worldview that you're talking about, particularly the African worldview, considering I'm sitting in South Africa now, and what I see around me is that individual behavior doesn't agree with what you're saying about the worldview, African philosophical worldview. There's almost an entitlement to this environment around us, and I think you did touch on some of these concepts. And then a third comment, and maybe this touches on this concept of on the concept of Ubuntu again, which you did mention, is that individual responsibility is almost absent if the whole community is considered responsible. No one cares about littering if the individual won't be held accountable. But I just came back from Germany, so this is the example I will use, is that when you do the same action there, the individual is very much targeted, and I don't feel that's the case in practice in South Africa if we consider it out of a Ubuntu philosophical worldview. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Roelof, will you give your question as well, and then we'll give Prof. Kelbessa time to respond.
Good morning, Prof. Kelbessa. Thank you for enlightening talk, and I must say it resonates deeply with my lived experience in Africa. Although I agree with Henno that there are some experiences that we need to expand on. So I'm also a physical scientist as Henno, so excuse my lack of articulation as I struggle through my argument. There's nothing that you said that I fundamentally disagree with. But I want to talk about the idea of renouncing anthropocentrism, and I might be barking up the same useful tree as Abiodun did. So there's two things I want to think about that maybe seeks to find a middle ground between anthropocentrism and the holistic African perspective that you shared. Firstly, it's recognizing that humans is a special member of the whole, something I think that the African perspective does, and this is the intrinsic center of humans that Abiodun said in my understanding, right? But then secondly, and this is the main point I want to make, is the priority of the need for continued development. And that's something I think that anthropocentrism and holism don't do, and it wasn't something that you mentioned this morning. So there are just criticism of anthropocentrism, and most importantly, maybe the idea of human primacy and the utilization or exploitation of resources. And in that way, the holistic perspective and the African, as you said, includes interconnectedness, balance, sustainability, co-evolution, which seems more positive. Now, what I want to consider is the world through a thermodynamic lens. And it is unquestionable that humans are then the tip of the arrow in terms of evolution, which for me underscores the need to protect and nurture humans. So the question I'm posing is that both these perspectives miss a central idea, and that is the need for constant progress and development. So while anthropocentrism supports this indirectly, it does seems to do so just for the sake of development and not an intrinsic need. But if you look at the problem again through a thermodynamic lens, and I'm thinking of authors like Stuart Kaufman and Claude Shannon, and maybe the Red Queen hypothesis commonly used in biology, I think this priority takes on another dimension, which is central to the survival of life on Earth. So if we value the whole and the survival of the whole, we have to value humans and we have to value development. And when we consider the climate crisis, this surely comes to the fore, and technological solution may be seen as our only realistic pathway out of the crisis. So I therefore propose the idea that the need for continued development for the sake of the survival of humans and the environment has to be our top priority.
Thanks, Roelof. Back to you, Professor Kelbessa.
Thank you very much for these excellent questions again. So the first one talks about holism. So the questioner was saying that we are connected to our environment. So when I said, for example, in African societies, we value African holism. As I said, different ethnic groups have developed a holistic view of the world, a holistic view of the world. That is, human beings are in nature and part of nature in balance with the whole, in balance with the whole. That's the most important point. And I've said that even ancient Egyptians have developed this view, and there is no absolute boundary between human life and non-human life. They are all interconnected. When I said this, I'm not saying that this is unique to Africa. And I don't mean that you don't find this view in other traditions. We can also find this view in other traditions, for example, in Asian traditions, even in some Western writers also share this view. Even in ancient Greek philosophy, we find Pythagoras and his followers, Pythagoreans, stated that animals and human beings are brothers and sisters. So that is very important to remember when we talk about environmental holism. But the point I would like to emphasize here is that instead of emphasizing anthropocentric concerns exclusively in African worldview, we find therefore the interdependence of holistic entities. Different elements are interrelated and interdependent. They cannot survive in isolation. And again, the first person also said that in relation to Ubuntu philosophy, individual responsibility is absent if you simply talk about community and probably avoid the role of individuals. So, and again, even in Ubuntu ethics, in African communitarian ethics, we also recognize sometimes the role of individuals. Individuals can develop their knowledge. Individuals can also have their own property and so forth. But the point is, when we talk about the relationship between individuals and a community, when, for example, most of the time in African worldviews, you might say that the predominance of relationality in African ethics can be considered as a hindrance to individual autonomy and independent personal decisions. You might say that sometimes this is the case. Nonetheless, as I said earlier, when, for example, an individual is required to, for example, avoid his own personal interest for the sake of the community, in African societies, yes, individuals are required to do so. We have to give priority to our communities. And as I've said, that in African worldview, to be means to belong. And we belong to our family, we belong to our ethnic group, our country, and we belong to the human race, and so on and so forth. But sometimes, as I said, for the sake of the well-being of the community, sometimes we can compromise our own interest, our own values. So in that sense, you might say that the rights of individuals probably can be compromised. And for that reason, therefore, we can't really avoid the responsibility of all individuals in that sense. So that is what I would like to emphasize. So individuals and community can live together, and the community can also support individuals to fulfill their basic needs and to promote their basic needs, and individuals promote the well-being of the community. And the next question was about renouncing anthropocentrism. The questioner talked about the importance of middle ground. And he said that humans are spatial members, and priority to continuous development and the need for constant development. So he said that most of the time anthropocentrism emphasized exploitation of natural resources without paying attention to sustainable development. And as you know, the concept sustainable development involves social concerns and at the same time political concerns and environmental concerns. So we need to talk about the relationship between development and at the same time environmental protection. Sometimes if you simply focus on development and avoid environmental protection, the end result will be negative. And that is why, for example, during the Rio conference in 1992, as you all know, developed countries try to emphasize the importance of environmental protection. They try to give priority to environmental concerns. But developing countries said that, no, you have already exploited your own resources and at the same time our own resources. And because of colonialism and other global structures, you have already made your own basic needs. And we need to also develop. So at the end of the day, therefore, they agreed on the concept sustainable development. Sustainable development embodies both development is very important, and at the same time, environmental protection is also important. So environmental protection and development can go together. But if you simply emphasize one of the two, and the end result will be negative. And as various scholars stated, environmental protection and at the same time economic development, social well-being can go together. And that is why, therefore, we have to pay attention to our environmental values. And at the same time, when we also invest, we should also pay attention to the impacts of our development efforts on the natural environment. So at the end of the day, therefore, both can go together. So as our colleague already stated, we need to emphasize, yes, the need for constant development, and we have to also value both development and environmental protection. So that is what I would like to emphasize. And when we look at African worldview, we have said that yes, most Africans have rejected anthropocentrism, and they emphasize positive relationship to rather than violent domination of the natural environment. So what is important is balancing the two important elements. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And our last question goes to Mumpati, who's one of our colleagues in philosophy. Mumpati, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yolandi, and thank you very much to Doc. Mine, it is not a question, by the way. It's just some few comments in complement of what Doc has just shared with us. I believe that one thing that maybe we can share with Doc is that the Northwest University, it's a house for Indigenous Knowledge System Center, and we have been providing a course, and I'm one of the graduates from that school. And something that has been close to me was Indigenous agriculture. And in Indigenous agriculture, we have dealt a lot about the issues of environmental ethics and how the Indigenous communities view the environment and the space they are within. But something that we have really recognized a lot, which most of the time people think that it is the Indigenous people's voice, are the policies and the protocols. We can recognize that the policies and the protocols which are designed, they're not necessarily from the bottom to the top approach. They're not applying bottom-top approach kind of strategies, but most of the time they are top-bottom approaches, and they lack so much of the voices of Indigenous community right there. And something that we also recognize through our studying, like what Doc has just said in the presentation, is the recycling of the knowledge, because you find people a lot recycling other people's studies and try to argue from those studies without not capturing the essence of it. We were once battling with the aspect of Ubuntu a lot in terms of how people present it and how different communities understand the use of the word and the application of the word in different spaces and time. However, I also heard Doc talking about the knowledge, the Indigenous knowledge, which is a localized knowledge, and it's a knowledge that is changing. We in IKS, we were used to say, even if there are innovations that are taking place, Indigenous knowledge system is not changing, but it is getting enhanced by these innovations. The knowledge remains itself, but it is transforming with time. And these transformations, we can see, for example, every time when we were used to argue in class, we were used to use China to say, you can see that even if there are so many innovations that are taking place in China, but the innovations does not make the community to lose the essence of the knowledge. Another aspect which I will maybe sit a lot on it, it was the methodology which was asked by one of the participants in the group. And I just got to realize that Doc has just quoted a lot in terms of other methodologies which he is applying. But I will share with the group the shortcomings that makes you not maybe get what you are looking for. For example, he said that he asked the participant the role of a woman, and then there were participants who were so angry and asked her, why are you asking about women and stuff like that? It is because of the approaches that we are using in research. I think, number one, we need to acknowledge that research has created a great harm in Indigenous communities. And since well, it has created a great harm in Indigenous communities, Indigenous people are no longer trusting researchers. Even if you come to them and say research can offer solution, or research can offer a space to voice out what you know, so that you can stand against what people think it is true, and you bring the truth on the table, people are no longer trusting the research in that essence. So what does it mean? It means that conducting researches in Indigenous communities must be done using Indigenous research methodologies. The indigenous research methodology says that the research is people-centered. That simply means the participants are the ones who are driving the research that you are doing. And the good thing that you must have when you conduct this research is to learn how to put issues on the table, at the same time learn how to probe in this participant. Because what challenge us most as scholars is that we have got knowledge that is already categorized. We are saying the knowledge is already packaged. That is why you have got philosophy, sociology, anthropology, and whatsoever. So those are the packages. And when you go and collect data in indigenous communities, you go with that package. It's like your research is theory-driven. And when it becomes theory-driven, it will lack the essence of what you need from the participants. So that's why we say it must be participant driven. If you are going to do a research about women leadership, it's good that you take it from the lens of the participants so that you could be able to know what are you looking for. And because if you package it already, you theorize it already, it will make it difficult for you to get what you want, and you'll end up saying the community does not have that. You'll find that in that space where the community member was saying to you, we can talk to you about the role of the leadership, the women's leadership within environmental ethics. Through probing, you could have get something that the reason we can't talk is because of this. And through the answer, you were going to be able to probe more. It was where the role of the women were going to be visible through probing. It's a matter of approaches that we are using and the strategies that we are using in different phases. And we're always in most of our time in our graduate schools, we're always reading so many articles, and we could spot this in so many articles to say, but you could have asked this question for you to answer this statement that you are looking for. So I think those are the cases that we need to look at it. And as researchers, we also, if we conduct research in indigenous spaces, we need to forget the aspect that we are academics. We need to take that fear and authority and put it aside and start to form part of that community so that participants can blend well with you. But when you come with the aspect of saying, I know better and I'm the scholar and whatever, the participants are not going to give you what you need. Remember, that is you who need that knowledge, not the participant. The participants have the knowledge and they're the ones who are living with that knowledge. But now when you go to them with that authority of I'm the one, it's mess up there. That's why you find I have moved away completely from calling them informants, like how other researchers are calling them. I'm calling them participants because the role will change. Even the role of you as a researcher will change. You will end up becoming a participant yourself. They can just shift it and be the one asking you questions and you answering the questions, but you should find a way to put your questions within the conversation. That's why we used to say, when you conduct research in those spaces, you are more of conversating with them and reawakening the knowledge that is there within the society. And that is why I'm saying those are the kind of the issues that I wanted to touch on them in terms of the presentation. But out of all, Prof, it was an eye-opening, and it really showed me that there is a gap in terms of knowledge generations for the future in environmental ethics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this excellent intervention. I totally agree with your views, and as you really, as you correctly stated, most of the time, the so-called scientists, scholars, and policymakers have imposed, in particular policymakers have imposed non-African policies and principles on African societies. As you know, for example, African policymakers were very much influenced by neoliberals, and therefore they try to emphasize the role of the market. And they didn't pay attention to indigenous values, local values, and so forth. And again, during the before the collapse of the Soviet Union, some countries were also influenced by socialist ideology and tried to impose socialist ideas and policies on their own people without paying attention to indigenous values. And as we said, the approach they used is top-down approach rather than bottom-up approach. I'm not saying that Africans cannot learn from non-African traditions. Yes, we can learn from non-African traditions. But the important point is we have to critically approach non-African traditions. And at the same time, we have to start with our own values. And as you said, therefore, the most important point is research should be a kind of people-centered approach. And that is why, as you said, and as I've already stated during my presentation, most of the time, peasant farmers don't trust newcomers because they thought that they come to their place to rob their knowledge and to impose their views on them and to destroy their knowledge, because the so-called educated people consider indigenous values and indigenous traditions as unscientific and at the same time the major causes of underdevelopment in different parts of the continent. And this has already happened. For example, I can give you some examples. As I've already mentioned, some scientists came to Ethiopia some years back, and those of you who know teff is a staple food in Ethiopia, and they took this teff and they went back to the Netherlands and they grow teff for some seasons, and then finally they said that we modified this teff, which has been produced and planted by Ethiopian peasant farmers for centuries. And they said, now we have already changed it, therefore we have to patent it. And therefore, Ethiopian peasant farmers should pay royalties before using this teff the next season. So the Ethiopian government has tried to challenge this. And that is why, therefore, some researchers, including some Western scientists, even including some African scientists, try to drive the knowledge of peasant farmers and try to exploit their knowledge without involving peasant farmers and pastoralists. So the solution is, therefore, we have to involve peasant farmers and other concerned individuals in the design and at the same time implementation of development policies. If we do so, therefore, peasant farmers can also trust researchers, and researchers can also trust the people. And at the end of the day, therefore, the end result will be positive, because there are some important elements that cannot be clearly stated or known by peasant farmers. And at the same time, there are also other elements that are not really well developed by scientists. So integrating, therefore, both knowledge, indigenous knowledge and modern knowledge can help humanity to address various problems, including climate change, development problems, and so on and so forth. So we can't simply rely on theory and try to impose our theory on the local people. First and foremost, we should also try to learn from the local people, and at the same time, we have to try to share our knowledge with the people. If we do so, therefore, the result will be positive and we'll be able to address most of the problems humanity is suffering from these days. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And that brings us to the end of the session. Please allow me to extend my warmest thank you to you, Professor Kelbessa. This has been a wonderful talk, and I'm sure I'm going to rewatch this lecture a few times in the coming weeks. It's been really fantastic. Thank you so much for offering up 2 hours of your day and doing all the prep for this talk. We really, really appreciate it. And yes, thank you everyone else for joining. Thank you for all the constructive comments, the engagements. It's been my favorite talk this year so far. So yes, everyone must have a lovely rest of your day. Again, thank you so much, Professor Kelbessa, and goodbye, everyone.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I've really enjoyed my participation in this, and I really liked various comments and questions raised by the participants. And I would also like to encourage South African scholars, in particular students, to go to the field and try to derive important lessons from indigenous South African knowledge, so that we will retain this knowledge before the owners of this knowledge die with the knowledge. And thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Goodbye, everyone. Goodbye.